Welcome back, YouTube. I'm here with Odon, and we're looking at the Qur'anic Mushrikūn. So, yeah, as you know, Odin is an author of a very, very good book discussing the early hypothesis of the founding of Islam, called The Great Secret of Islam, right? Available in English and French. And
This one.
Excellent book. Get a copy. You can get it in PDF. You can go to his website, The Great Secret of Islam. You can get it for free. Otherwise, you can get it on Amazon. So, yeah, so we're here to discuss again the implications of this thesis and try to look at what other scholars have to say. And I'm just looking at different perspectives, and I'm trying to sort of figure out not necessarily the answers. We're always looking for answers, but I also want to ask the right questions. We want to look at what other scholars have said, what other scholars have, what evidence they've looked at, and maybe their biases and preconceptions, and try to see if we can, from these, try to figure out what the right ways, to interpret all of this and to find, to come closer to the facts, to the truth. So yeah, and Odon, so welcome. How are you doing?
Yeah, hello, Lloyd. I'm doing okay. Yeah, I'm soon to move in my new flat, so I will get access to my books, my stuff, and I will start a sort of video studio,
Nice.
a bit like you, and I will be doing lives and so on, mostly for my French-speaking audience. So I'm eager to these new things.
Okay. Little Main says nice haircut. I did mention your haircut when we first came online. So
I had to do something about it.
yeah, no, I don't have. Yeah, my hair, just keep it short and leave it at that. But you still have hair, so. So welcome. Archambault says bonsoir. Hold on. Okay, yeah. So let me just share my screen, and but yeah, it'll be nice if you have an own studio in the new place. We're also going to have a 2-bedroom apartment, and I want to obviously customize one side of it. So that'll be our spare bedroom and my office with my computer on one side and bed on the other for guests and so on. And yeah, I'm hoping to decorate it to make it look really nice. So I'm going there tomorrow to meet with a builder again, and so yeah, let's hope we can have a nice studio and try to be a little bit more I don't know, upgrade things a little bit. So yeah, so welcome HH and Villainous. Good to see you. Always good to see you. And of course, the little domain. Yep. So let me share my screen. So this has been, I think this is episode 4. Hopefully we can finish here today with this topic. But I think the topic, though, also lends itself to investigating deeper into the people, the places, the history, the concepts, looking at the narrative, what the Quran literally says versus what we know from history. I mean, this allows us to explore, I think, deeper, and also look at what the academics are saying and see where do these converge and where do these conflict. So I'm hoping to use this as a way to go into other topics and, also look at it from all these different perspectives, because I think even as call us amateurs, although, I mean, there are those snobby YouTubers who say, well, you don't have a PhD, so really you should just go hide in the corner and cry. There is one who dismissed my knowledge of Sharia because I don't have a PhD, when the PhD who was on his channel was just lying through his teeth at him and he was swallowing it all. So there's that. But that's a well-known Catholic YouTuber, by the way. So, but on that point, hopefully we can, as amateurs, we can actually push the conversation forward. We can push the narrative forward, and we can start to go the places where scholars are afraid to go, where they have the dots, they won't connect them. Hopefully we can connect those dots. Yeah. Any thoughts on that point, Odon?
Yeah, one thought is that it's very interesting to look at all these studies, Patricia Crone studies and so on, but the research never stops, and sometimes you get to some tipping points or threshold, and it might happen that some very interesting papers become outdated.
Right. Right. That is true. I mean, and again, sometimes this doesn't mean we also throw the baby out with the bathwater, because sometimes there are nuggets
Yeah,
in these papers. So we may
that's
not
the thing.
thing, but there are things to maintain there that are worth examining and exploring. And sometimes they are great little things that just make you question, and it opens up a whole new vista if you just investigate.
Actually, this is exactly the thing I wanted to point at. We are not talking about religion. There is no abrogation within science. It doesn't work this way. And we can always look at outdated papers with a scientific mind and find some very useful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So I'm always one for reading old papers. I found so much amazing material in papers that were written in the 1800s, 1900s. There is so much material that's been forgotten that is still relevant today. Things that scholars are discovering today, which were well known 150 years ago. So, yeah. So let me go into the Judaizers. Now, I'm not going to dig into any real depth into any of these topics, but I want to present an overview of the information, and then, of course, hopefully we ask some good questions, and to explore the topic with, and to see if there's something more beyond the standard narrative. So we want to obviously debunk the standard Islamic narrative, and we want to look, are the areas for further exploration? Can we tie this to other things that we can also investigate that may be useful? And of course, get Odon's experience and insights on this. So the Judaizers, let's have a quick overview. So the Mushrikūn seems to have incorporated elements from Judaism, blending Jewish stories and laws into their beliefs. This is relevant, and I'll come to that a little later. We'll explain why, especially once I get to Robert Hoyland. Right? So the Mushrikun seem to have incorporated elements from Judaism, blending Jewish stories and laws into their beliefs. Now, of course, your view is that the Mushrikun are the Christians, right, Odon? Not necessarily Orthodox, but they are Christianized. Can you maybe just explain how you would phrase that?
I think they were Christian Arabs. And I explain this by an overview of the Quran. If you look at the whole of the Quran, you see there are different believers categories: Jews, Nazarenes, Mushrikuns, Kuffar. And you have to try to make sense out of it. And the first thing you come to realize is that the Nazarenes are not the Christians that the standard Islamic narrative says they are.
Yeah.
They are Jews. So where are the Christians within the text? Because there is only one mention of the people of the gospel. Otherwise, it's only Nazarenes, Jews, associationists, associators, or kuffars, coverers. So who are the Christians? And when you look at the expression mushrikun, we already said it in previous presentations. The etymology based on the SRK root, shirk,
associators, partners.
Associators. It is exactly the same as the Hebrew word that was used and that is still used by Jews to refer to Christians. So it's not the same word exactly, but it's the same meaning. There is something within Rabbinic Judaism to designate Christians as associators. And the thing with associators is it cannot refer to pagans, because a pagan doesn't know the very concept of the one God. That's why he is pagan. Otherwise, he wouldn't be pagan. So he cannot associate the one God with lesser deities.
Yeah.
If you look at the Greek pagan, for example, he does not associate Zeus with Aphrodite, for example, because he does not consider Zeus to be the one God. So the expression mushrikun makes sense only in the case of a monotheistic believer criticizing another monotheistic believer, telling him, your monotheistic faith is not monotheistic enough, in my view.
Yeah, judgmental. Yeah. I want to say thank you to Archambault de Saint-Amand. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I don't speak any French, but thank you. That's £2. And thank you very much. Yeah, also don't forget, Patricia Crone does talk about mitigated monotheism, where there's some kind of syncretism going on. So she speaks here of blending Jewish stories.
One last thing, Lloyd, please. When a pagan becomes Christian, he incorporates in his belief elements from Judaism also. And he gets to know the story of Moses, of Abraham, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, a believer who incorporates elements from Judaism can also be a Christian.
Yeah, true. Fair point. So these people have incorporated Jewish stories and laws into their beliefs to legitimize their practices within a monotheistic context. Right. So this can suggest there's a tendency towards intercession and mediation similar to biblical worship rather than outright idolatry. So intercession and mediation is something that early Christians practiced. It's common within the Catholic Church. And this is not idolatry, although Muslims today will call that idolatry, right? They call standard Christianity or Orthodox Christianity idolatry. So the presence of elements like this indicates a syncretic religious environment where Judaism influenced polytheistic customs, right? Now, although the Mushrikūn recognized a singular God, and we've spoken of henotheism and Gnosticism prior, their veneration of lesser divine beings is a parallel to the angelic worship seen in post-exilic Judaism and early Christianity. So this raises questions about the nature of their practices, questions, if not straight up answers. So clearly there's an interplay between monotheistic and polytheistic beliefs in pre-Islamic Arabia. So, and again, this is evidence for religious integration of syncretism that would later influence Islamic thought. Right. Now, just a comment. So that's just a brief. I'll come back to the Judaizers in a moment. So it's just that there's these elements of Jewish, a lot of Jewish elements. So clearly there's a strong Jewish element there, but it's not Orthodox Jewish, and there's a Christian element, but it's not Orthodox Christian. So just a comment someone left in my comment section on one of the videos we did. They stated the debate over religious practices in Mesopotamia and Arabia is often undervalued. Right, so major religions that were present in the region include Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, amongst others. Right, there was also, we know that these people were trading in Rome, they were trading in Greece, so they were bringing back these deities, these carved deities, these idols, and bringing it back to Arabia. Right, there were also Manichaeans and Neoplatonists influencing the region. That's something, the Manichaeism and the Neoplatonist influence is something I definitely must get to, because you'd be surprised how much Neoplatonism influenced Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy. And then Manichaeism, there's a strong influence with Muhammad as well and Islam, because that also has a Gnostic influence, and that is predicated upon something I've mentioned earlier called the Al-Chasai. And also don't forget, when you speak of Mesopotamia, there was also the Mesopotamian religion of Shin. This was very prevalent in Yemen and also in Ethiopia at the time. And according to the standard narrative, at least, the Muslims spent their first hijrah, 14 or 15 years in Ethiopia. So, and that religion was also very prevalent in the region through Nabonidus and then also through the Yemenis. Any comment or thought on that before I go on? That there was at least previously a very strong influence of multiple religions, pagan religions, and so on.
I don't think the influence was that strong, because most people were Christians. Most people were Christian in Mesopotamia, so they were Nestorian Christians.
At what time, though? You said what period? So
in the 7th century. In the 7th century. And the Arabs were Christians also. So I agree with you that there can be some influence from all these religions and philosophies and so on. But I think it's, in my view, it's better to see it as is Christianity today. It's very influenced by other beliefs.
There's a paper that I'll cover. There's a paper that I'll do, which discusses the fight for orthodoxy within Arabia. So the appearance and the struggle of Christianity within Arabia, which is actually really interesting. I think it dates back to the 30s, maybe the 60s. It's almost unheard of, but it's fascinating. And it talks about a lot of history that is previously unknown, because scholars always had the view there was no Christianity out there, because that was the Islamic view. This paper brings up evidence that says, hold on, that's all wrong. And this paper's been just forgotten, which I need to cover as well. So now...
And there is something else about Arabia. As Arabia within the Arab Peninsula was on the fringes of the two empires, it was not incorporated within the Roman Empire, neither with the Persian Empire. So it was a sort of refuge for all heretics and all those who had strange ideas and strange religions. So I want to mitigate what I just said by stating that there was a sort of concentration of heresy in that region. But there is another thing to bear in mind. The origins of Islam, or at least the origins of the movements that gave birth to Islam, is not to be found only in Arabia. This is what the standard Islamic narrative imposed, a unique place of origin. Whereas we see that there are influences from Ethiopia, from the Levant. We see descriptions within the Quran of places that cannot be in Arabia, for example. I'm about to publish 2 articles in English. One about the place of Abraham being in Jerusalem, and another one about the barrier between the 2 seas. It's something very interesting, but it's sort of an anecdote. There are a few verses in the Quran that refer to a saltwater sea and a freshwater sea that seems to be connected. There is a connection between them, even though there is a sort of barrier. And this type of configuration with saltwater and freshwater is not to be found in Arabia. We have situations like this in Syria, for example, with the Lake of Homs and the Mediterranean Sea, or in Israel with the Galilee Lake and the Dead Sea. But we do not have such thing in Arabia.
Yeah, I know.
So it is a clue. It's just a clue that there was something happening outside also of Arabia.
Yeah. This is just one paper that discusses the presence of heresy in Arabia. This is not the one I referred to earlier, but this is just one paper. Arabia, Heresium, Ferax, and schismatic Christianity's influence on Muhammad and the Quran. So, okay, let's go on. Let's finish this. Okay, so previous native beliefs likely persisted despite their decline because they were culturally embedded, so there would be some remnant of that remained. Coptic Christian Egypt provides a parallel where ancient mystery religion or pagan beliefs were integrated into Christian practices. You see it in voodoo, and we've seen it in other practices. Even in South Africa, where I come from, you find that Christianity, there are cults that have merged Christianity with the animism and other sort of black pagan cultures, and they create their own religions. It's you see that happen. Local communities retain the traditions and folkways of their ancestors, and magic spells in Coptic Egypt were a fusion of Christian and pre-Christian beliefs, and magic is a major part of Islam. We don't understand it as Westerners. We don't appreciate just how much. And also, Owa Atek says, so it may not be a major influence on the author of the Quran, but later traditions were tacked on, certainly at a large Manichaean and other influences. Yeah, because we're also looking at different things at different times. Heretical Islamic sects, such as the Druze, embody a mix of Islamic and pre-Islamic philosophies. These are essentially sort of Gnostic / Zoroastrian / Islamic. So you see this syncretism that still survives today, and they're not the only group. And I've actually been in that part of the world.
If you take the Alawites, for example, they believe in a sort of reincarnation, metempsychose.
No, another word, but yeah.
And clearly it doesn't come from Platonicism or Christianity or Judaism. It comes from the very far east, from Buddhism maybe.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So clearly some of these ideas are somehow infused into the culture. There was some kind of sharing and some kind of syncretism. So there's a tapestry of belief systems rather than clear black and white. There wasn't necessarily strict orthodoxy. Okay, just want to mention that. So why do the Judaizers and why Muslims hate Paul? That's always been a question that's bugged me. Why do they hate Saint Paul so much? So in Patricia Crone's paper, the term Judaizers sorry, I missed the H in your last name. Lloyd Dean, can you please cite resource in the Coptic Church and paganism? Would help me out. You're going to have to go to Mr. Google for that right now. So in Patricia Crone's paper, the term Judaizers refers to individuals and groups who adopt Jewish beliefs or practices, but in a syncretic religious context. So the Judaizers refers to a group of, or typically it refers to early Christians who advocated for the observance of Jewish laws and customs by Gentile non-converts to Christianity. Now, of course, Paul pushed back against this and says, hold on, the point is not to be Jews. The point is to adopt this new covenant, right, which started with Christ. So, of course, there was this conflict between them. So instead of adopting Judaism, the Gentiles, instead of the Gentiles becoming Jews, the thing is, why don't we all just become Christians, right? That's
Can I make a point there, Lloyd?
Yeah, that was a very big oversimplification.
Yeah, I think it's too much of a simplification. It doesn't help us understand what happened. Anyone becoming Christian becomes a Jew. It's very strong. It's the core of the Christian faith, even though most Christians don't recognize it.
It's a continuation of the Jewish covenant. Sure.
Yeah, they are integrated in a sort of a mystical Israel people or something like this. And so the question was asked whether the Gentiles should abide by the law. But why was the question asked? Because they were Jews.
That's the Mosaic.
Because they were Jews. And the thing is that we see Judaism with the lens of rabbinic Judaism, which is a development of post-Christian Judaism. We have to know that in the first centuries and even in the centuries thereafter, Judaism was still a universal religion. So there were many converts to Judaism. It was possible for a Gentile, a pagan, to become a Jew, but he had to abide by the law and so on. And what Christianity brought is the possibility to become a Jew without abiding by the law. And this was something that was unbearable for those who launched the rabbinic Judaism. They could not stand having people so different from them, not abiding by the law and so on. And this is why rabbinic Judaism stated that Judaity is only transmitted by the mother, and it became very, very hard for anyone to convert to Judaism within the rabbinic reform.
So it was very prominent. This Judaizer movement was very prominent in the first centuries of the Christian church. The leaders were arguing that to be a true follower of Christ, you must also adhere to the Jewish law, the Mosaic law. So, of course, here's where there was a major conflict. I covered this some time ago, but I can always discuss this at another time. I can get my notes out and we can go through that history. But they had to follow circumcision, dietary restrictions, and observance of Jewish holy days. Now, circumcision and dietary restrictions, those things are very much part and parcel of Islam. So it seems they've inherited this, and the observance of Jewish holy days. So they've certainly inherited some kind of structure, like they've got they've got their own Friday and so on. So this seems to be they've absorbed some of these ideas. They were influenced by these ideas at the very minimum. So the most notable discussion can be found in the New Testament. You've got the letters of Paul. speaking of the tension between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians. How do we include them as part of us, right?
Mhm.
So the Council of Jerusalem in the book of Acts is the event where the leaders of the early church, including Peter and Paul, deliberate over whether Gentile converts should be required to follow Jewish laws. But the point was a new covenant, so not to follow the Mosaic law. You're no longer part of that particular doctrine. Yes?
If I can make a little point, if you look at the text of the so-called Council of Jerusalem, it happens in Jerusalem for a reason. And the reason is that in the Holy Land, there were mostly Jewish Jews. You see, there were not that many Gentile Jews or proselytes. And so the conflict between Gentile Jews and Jewish Jews was at its harshest point in Jerusalem. If you lived, for example, in Rome, there was no such a conflict, because in Rome there were already many Latin Jews, Romans who converted to Judaism and who abided by the law and so on. You see something that is very specific to the Holy Land situation. When Jews were living in the outside world with the Gentiles, the question of their purity and the separation from the non-Jews was not as adamant or even relevant as it was for Israeli Jews from the Holy Land.
Yeah, the thing is, I don't want to spend the whole of the next half hour sort of nitpicking every single detail of this. I did say I wasn't going to go into any depth on this. I'm giving an overview because this is, so. Okay, so there was a conflict between early Christianity and Judaism. There were debates about identity, traditions, the laws, morality, and interpretation of religious texts, as well as cultural practices, right? What we would call practices that were not necessarily, what would you call it? Cultural practices, cultural religious practices, like the washing of hands and so on, right? Now, you've got a conflict here. So you've got these groups that have these Jewish ideas, and they consider the Christians their enemies, or the ones who are following the wrong law. They should follow the law. They should follow the Sharia, if you will. Judaism is a religion of law. Islam's religion of law. It has the Sharia. It has its own Talmud, which is the Sharia, just like the rabbinic Jews had their Talmud, which had their laws as well, whereas the Christians are free of that law. So now you've got this conflict. You've got this divide. So if the mušrikūn are Judaizers, there's some considerations, right? There's some implications. So these pagans may have worshipped a singular god alongside other figures. Now, there's the possibility that these Jews also adopted some pagan practices, that they may have adopted some other cultural practices into their religious mix. Okay, so there were some Jewish traditions that included intercessors or saints, or they could be part of this messianic Jewish tradition. So there might be a shared understanding of divine authority across religious traditions. So this was a challenge to the strict dichotomy that Islam often asserts between monotheism, or their version of monotheism, and polytheism, or Judaism viewed through the lens of later rabbinical teachings. Because there was even conflict with the Jews that stated that Christians are worshipping God in the wrong manner, because there's only one God, not a multiplicity of gods. Would that be correct, Odon?
I have another opinion. I think for every Jew, the question of the uniqueness of God is central to his belief. It's the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Elonehu, Adonai Echad.
Yeah. But that was
God
a later interpretation.
God is unique.
You had a complex unity, because the Shema even has the idea of a complex unity.
Yeah,
like a bunch of
the
grapes.
uniqueness of God, its unity doesn't mean that God cannot dwell on earth. Or if you look in Old Testament Judaism, God has a wisdom that is sort of independent from him. The wisdom of God does things. The force of God does things. And so Jews before Christianity were not like Muslims are. For a Muslim, God is supposed to not to take part into his creation.
Yeah.
Whereas in ancient Judaism, it was not the case. So there was a different.
I mean, Jews. In fact, if you look at the term, what's it? The Jews, or was it Israel? What's the term? Those who wrestle with God. The Palestinians, Palestis. In fact, Palestine may not come from the Philistines. It may come from the Greek term Palestis, meaning those who wrestle with God. Because the Jews are known as those who wrestle with God, meaning God comes down as a man and you wrestle with him.
Exactly, like Jacob did in the Bible. Yeah. He wrestled with God.
They wrestle morally, philosophically, but also in the real world. So yeah.
And you see, I think rabbinic, because of Christianity, there was a sort of the Jewish monotheism became more and more hardcore. Before Christianity, it was much more loose.
So there was a split caused by Christianity, and then Saint Paul was the guy that made that split final. His decisions.
I don't know whether it is Saint Paul or old Christian from the 1st and 2nd century, and maybe thereafter. There was a sort of reaction from Jews towards Christianity, the early Christianity, which we find also in the Quran and in Islam. Islam is also a sort of response to Christianity.
So don't forget, though, you've got St. Paul made a separation within, we are now these Christians, we're going this way, and the old law goes this way. So you've got a group that says, hold on, monotheism only, like X, and then the Christians are going off. So already there's a parallel conflict, very similar to what these Muslims are saying about Christianity. So just want to point that out, really. So
I kind of agree that St. Paul was a very central figure in early Christianity, but he is not the one who invented it. Everything is already in the Gospels.
Yeah, but there's a decision that's made that says, look, we are going to now.
It was not Paul's decision. It was the apostles' decision.
Granted,
and Paul was not one of the apostles.
But then he also creates a lot of the theology. He creates a lot of the. He influences a lot of the decision making.
For sure. But
so look,
we agreed, and the others were the head of the church at the time. Paul was not the head.
That's why there was a council. I noticed. I said there was a council in Jerusalem, so there was a council. But he's one of the figures that's mentioned, and then of course his theology influences how Christianity works because of his training as a rabbi. So now you've got people who are. It's a very. I mean, I don't want to sit here the whole day nitpicking again on this one particular point. I just want to mention this
for the rest of the presentation. You see, when you look at Indian Christianity in India or in China, I don't know whether they received Paul's letter very early, and nonetheless they had the same face. You see, Paul's letter mostly they were addressed to Mediterranean Christians.
Yeah, those who are falling out.
To Central Asian Christians, Mesopotamian Christians, and so on, and Indian Christians. There were Indian Christians.
What I'm saying
India
is, without getting into a whole. The point is, Paul makes certain statements which this group seems to cling to and says Paul made the split. Right? Whether it's right, whether it's wrong, we're not dealing with PhD scholars here. We're dealing with idiots, as we know. But the idiots need a reason, and they need someone to blame, and they blame Paul. Now, when we look at Paul's role, that fits the bill exactly. Yeah. So the potential identification of the Mushrikūn as Judaizers suggests that the cultural and religious practices in pre-Islamic Arabia were not purely polytheistic, but clearly influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions. So there's a syncretism. So there's a significant transformation of Islamic identity, legitimizing claims to continuity with prior monotheistic faiths. while still trying to distinguish themselves as the completion or the correction of these traditions. So they're trying to legitimize themselves by claiming that they are part of the tradition, but they're also trying to separate themselves from the tradition, and they've got to somehow justify this. So they've got to claim that, well, the claim of this and the claim of that, therefore you guys are false, and boom, off we go. And they separate. Now, there's very harsh condemnation of the mushrikūn, and thank you very much, Steve Gordon. He says, both of you bring great information to the public.
Thanks.
Harry L. Johnson, oh my gosh, thank you very much. Again, thank you, much appreciated, very grateful. Thank you. So there's very harsh condemnation of the mushrikūn, and you can frame this as a critique of polytheism. That's one way to look at it, but also of apostasy from a supposedly previously understood monotheistic tradition. The Muslims claim there was a previously understood tradition, and we all deviated from that, right? That's, of course, their claim of tahrif. We are the apostates from whatever, and they are the original religion. They're restoring it. So they emphasize a rejection of authentically monotheistic practices contaminated by idolatry, the worship of three gods. Now, you can have multiple interpretations. You have tritheism, right? That's John Philoponus, an idea of three separate gods. You've got the concept of henotheism we've already discussed. But the Muslims claim for whatever reasons, they claim they are the strict monotheists. They are the correct monotheists, and we are idolaters. And so therefore, they use this as a pretext, a narrative, to separate what they claim is the true faith from corruption. And they also then claim that Islam is morally and theologically superior because they are following the true faith. Because if they've inherited a lot of Jewish ideas, right? If they've inherited some of these Jewish ideas and Christian ideas and integrated that into their faith, then they've also got to continue this this antagonism with Christians, with those who are the true faith. So that's just an idea that I want to put forward there. Any last word on that, Odon?
Maybe there is something to say, and I should have said it earlier. It's about the Judaizer expression. Actually, in the Quran, it's Hadu, or Aladina Hadu. And the right translation for it, as you can see it in Murad's translation, for example, is those who is not actually Judaized, who became Jew. Those who were not Jew and became Jew. So there are many meanings to such an expression. It can mean someone who takes something from Judaism, but it can also point to proselytes.
That's referring to converts, I guess, but I'm thinking this is just carrying forward. This is partly carrying forward an old conflict and then looking for someone to blame to justify their split and their condemnation.
And it's when you look at the Quranic text, which is our earliest material for this history, there are something, I think, 8 occurrences of the expression Aladina Hadu. And it's very strange because in some of these expressions, there is a sort of positive connotation. They are supposed to be good people. And in other, they are identified with Jews, with common Jews. And so you see, it is not, I think it is not a homogeneous group. It is not a group, let's say. It's a category. There are people who became Jews, so they either become good Jews or bad Jews. And
yeah, I mean, look, it's a soup. It's not, there's no clear lines here. There's no necessarily clear delineation. And the story changes over time, so it's not so easy to create these necessary distinctions.
Yeah, and when you look at an Islamic translation of the Quran, it's even clearer because for at least 4, I've looked at the Sahih International translation. For many of these occurrences, it isn't even translated as those who Judaized or those who became Jew, but as Jews. There is no distinction. Even though the literal text says those who became Jew, Aladina Hadu.
Yeah, look, I'm not talking about Judaizers in the Quran as such. I'm saying there's the situation of the Judaizers, and Patricia Crone mentions them, and the fact that there was this conflict between the Judaizers and the Christians, and they split. Then you've got the Christians are the bad guys, and these Jews, these Judaizers might be the good Jews, might be allied, and those ideas might form part of the Muslim mindset. And then, of course, that carries through that conflict that the Christians are bad because they don't follow the law. Because that's another claim Muslims still make today. We don't follow the law. Like, yeah, we don't.
The conflict was on a much larger scale. It was between the Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians and all the Jews who did not want Jesus as their Messiah. And among those Jews, there are the Nazarene, there are the Rabbinic Jews, and so on. And there are some people who converted to the various movements of these other Jews. So the Judaizers, I think, can refer to some who converted to cults. There were movements like the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, and many others that are described by the ancient historians and the church fathers. So maybe some of those who Judaized joined this sect, because maybe some of these sects, some of these cults were open to converts, and some others join mainstream rabbinic Judaism.
But see, if some of these ideas carried through, then they would carry through these conflicts. So you've got so paraphrasing from Patricia Crone's
Can I just
argument,
make just another small point? We have testimonies. We have ancient sources such as Sozomenus, who talks about Arabs having converted to Judaism in Palestine and in Arabia. And this is an interesting point because it could go well with what you're proposing. Imagine that these Arabs were pagans who converted to Judaism, and so they might have kept some of their old pagan practices and customs. They were called the Ishmaelites and so on, but Ishmaelites it's not an homogeneous group again.
We know the Yemenis converted wholesale to Judaism, and they were pagans, and they were probably not, would say, Orthodox, and they were following the Babylonian religion. So there probably was a syncretism there as well. I mean, these are not sophisticated thinkers. So yeah, okay. So you've got paraphrasing from and trying to extend the ideas that Patricia Crone's presenting. Right, you've got this Arab-Nazarene alliance, and it breaks down due to political and territorial disputes, but also due to religious differences, right? So what are the theological implications? So the Quran questions who qualifies as a true believer based on ethics and community. Jews who accepted Jesus, like the Judeo-Nazarenes, were viewed differently from rabbinical Jews, which complicates the Quranic views, right? So you've got this, so the Quran seems to potentially make that distinction, right? So it does make a distinction between different groups of Jews. If the Mushrikun were Judaizers, this would change how we interpret some texts. So how do we shape an identity that was separate from earlier Jewish sects, focusing on a new faith centered on Muhammad? So they reject the idea of Jesus, but yet they embrace the idea of Muhammad. And you've got this Jewish influence that, you got the skewed Jewish group. So I guess that's what's implied here. So there's reason to re-examine how we think about this, right? In terms of the influence of just the Jews, their conflict with the Christians, how the two groups split, and then you're seeing the split again repeated. And then, of course, there are the good Jews, the bad Jews, and the Christians. So I'm not saying that I have an answer to this, but but clearly there's some sort of connection there. I mean, would you say there's some kind of connection? There's the good Jews, the bad Jews. They've accepted some ideas, absorbed some of them. They form an alliance. They throw the bad ones out, and eventually eventually the Quran actually tries to make almost a clean break and separates completely from the previous theology and goes on its own way. But it seems there was a time when there was some kind of, what would you call it, a compact, an alliance. I mean, there was this attempted monotheistic alliance, and then eventually that split off, or that broke up.
Yeah, I already told you this, but I don't agree with Patricia Crone's view on the Judaizers.
Yeah.
I don't think they were mushrikūn at all, because I think mushrikūn were Christians. On the margin, maybe you can find a Judaizer who became Christian, or a Christian who became a Jew. Maybe it can work for in some cases, but mostly mushrikuns are Christians, and so the connections with Judaizer is not here to be found.
Patricia Crone sort of implies that perhaps some of these Jews adopted, the implication is there that the Jews adopted some pagan rites, that these Jews became corrupt. I mean, there's kind of room for that interpretation. Briefly, now, I couldn't get hold of this guy's paper, Gerard Horting. He's the one that inspired Patricia Crone, and to get the paper was impossible. So I'll just give a brief overview taken from Robert Hoyland, right? So Robert Hoyland, in his paper, The Idea of Idolatry, if anyone has a copy, please let me know. What kind of pagans were they then? The question has acquired particular urgency since the publication in 1999 of Horting's Idea of Idolatry, which demonstrated how little the pagans of the Quran have to do with those of the tradition. So the Quran doesn't seem to speak of idolatry at all. And yet the standard narrative discusses idolatry ad nauseum, which is not present in the Quran. So this is in Patricia Crone, The Religion of the Qur'ānic Pagans, God and the Lesser Deities. So Horting shows key differences between the pagans in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. Right? He challenges the assumptions of mušrikūn as simple idolaters. And so basically this reinforces Patricia Crone's idea, but also it says, it shows that other scholarship agrees, right, with what we've been discussing here so far. His findings suggest that the Qur'anic pagans incorporated elements of monotheism alongside veneration of lesser deities. So now we're back to henotheism, we're back to Gnosticism, and we're back to syncretism, right? So he goes along that line. So this means that we should further examine their beliefs and practices, right? Because there's inconsistencies rather than accepting the standard Islamic narrative. So Crone says it's urgent to reassess the historical and theological context of the mushrikūn, particularly regarding the evolving understanding of pre-Islamic Arabian religion and its influence on later Islamic thought. Now, Hoyland also takes it to task, just like you have. Hoyland takes it to task as well. Hoyland agrees with some things and heavily disagrees on others, right, with Crone, because he points out an issue very similar to what you've pointed out. So, yeah, any thoughts on this before I go on? But there's clearly people are saying, well, the standard narrative does not match the Quran, and these are not taken, right?
Horting, in this very paper, was the one who drew parallels between the mushrikūn, the accusation of associationism within the Quran and within Islam, and the shituf, which is the same word that is used in Hebrew by Jews, referring to Christians. So another clue that the mushrikuns are actually Christians.
Okay, yeah. So someone loves your haircut. I'm digging the Odon haircut from Ryan Spencer. One day I hope to be able to rock the silver hair and beard look. All right,
it's not that easy because it's 3 colors, 4 colors. There is some gray and white, also some blonde hair remaining here a bit, and the beard is Venetian, so it's not red, it's Venetian, it's different, and also a bit white. So you have a whole palette of colors.
All right. So Nusara, not mushrikūn, right? So this is, you will surely find the most intense of the people in animosity towards the believers to be the Jews and those who associate others with Allah. That's Quran 582. And you will find the nearest in affection to the Muslims or the believers, those who say, we are Christians. That's because among them are priests and monks. Okay, fine. Let's just leave that there for the moment. Let's go to the Saint Murad translation. The Jews and those who partnered are the most intense of humans in encroachment to those who believed. And those who said, surely we are Nasara, are the most proximate or the closest in fondness to those who believed. Now, what I find odd here is that the Jews don't associate partners with Allah. Why is the Quran making the claim? The Jews and those who associate others with Allah. What kind of Jews are these? It's very odd Jews.
There is a difference here that is made between the Jews and those who partnered.
Okay, so there's a distinction. It's not lumping them in the same category. Jews and other group. Okay.
Jews and the mušrikūn. Those who partnered are the mušrikūn.
Now, so they accuse the Christians of partnering with Allah, but these are Christians that don't partner with Allah. So what kind of Christians are these?
They are Nasara. They are not Christian. They are Nazarenes.
They're Nazarenes, so they're not. Yeah, so they're Nasara.
The whole point of my book.
But they're also not Christians, because these are clearly monotheist Christians that don't believe in a Trinity. They're anti-Trinitarian. Would you say that's a reasonable conclusion?
Yeah, they are not Christian. They are not Christian in the Christian meaning, because they do not believe Jesus is God, and they are opposed to those who partner.
So these are anti-Trinitarian heretics who claim to be Christians. Those who claim to be Christians but are not.
I don't think they claim to be Christians. They claim to be the true disciples of Jesus, whereas for them, the Christians are heretics.
The Muslims make the same claim.
Yeah, and the thing that is very interesting here in this verse is that there is a contradiction between this verse and another one in the same surah, 551. Maybe you have planned to show it afterwards.
I can bring it up. 551.
In 551, the Nazarenes are said to be the enemies of the believers, and in this verse, 582, they are supposed to be the closest in affection. So there is a contradiction here, and because of this contradiction, some Muslim translators of the Quran could not translate Nasara as Christians. They recognized that there was something wrong, and so they translated Nazarenes.
Right, so that also tells us that there was a change in time, because at one point it was like A, and the next point later on it's like B. So there's a conflict. So something changed in the meantime. So there's a serious inconsistency here in this story. I just want to mention offhand, okay, you'll find the nearest of them those who say we are Christians. So they claim to be Christians, but they're clearly not Christians. These are heretics. These are clearly not Orthodox.
Those who say we are Nasara.
We are Nasara. So they claim so. So the original text is Nasara, not Christians. It's just been interpreted as Christians.
It's so later on, reinterpreted by the Islamic narrative as Christians.
As Christians. Okay. Now I just want to mention, just offhand, don't want to get into long song and dance here. So the word synagogue comes from a Greek word meaning assembly of men or congregation, much like the English word church. Now, notice also, I just want to mention there are those who claim Christianity, those who claim, but are not necessarily, they may have said they were Christians. So the Quran may not call them Christians, but they claim that they were the followers of Christ, technically making them Christians, right? So I know about the slander, Revelation 2:9, or the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, I know that Jews hate, people who hate Jews, anti-Semites, will say, well, here the Bible is saying that Jews are not Jews, but are Satanists, whatever. These are very simple-minded thinkers. These are Jews who are claiming to be Jews, but are not Jews, right? Just like these Christians here who are claiming to be Christians, but are not Christians. They're heretics. They're heretical. They're outside of the fold. They're outside of the church, outside of the congregation, right? That's all that. So you've got a similar situation developing here. I would think, and heresy was rife in that region. That's something I want to talk about in a couple of other papers that are fascinating history that people have not heard of. That's amazing, the amount of history I've not seen discussed anywhere else. So I just want to make a note that this is not an unknown situation. These people are liars, right? They will say they're Christians. They will claim to be. So there's a difference between, sure, we know that they are Nasara, right? They eventually become reinterpreted as Christians, but they are claiming to be the true Christians, at least in their context. Whereas clearly they can't be because they do not associate. So therefore they are anti-Trinitarian. Okay, so 3 groups of heretics. So the term Nasara and implications surrounding the classification of Christians in the context of Islamic theology, looking at Odon's work, a guy called Odon Lafontaine. So there's a complex relationship between the Nasara, often falsely interpreted as Christians. See, Odon, it's not like I didn't know. I did put it there. Sometimes I'm getting to a point later. Yeah, sorry.
I think we made 3 presentations on the topic on your channel.
So
Jews
Nasara,
and Nazarenes in the Quran.
Yeah, so Nasara appears 15 times in the Quran, right? These occurrences were initially not synonymous with Christians as understood in later Islamic contexts. So they point to historical references where this is a specific group termed Judeo-Nazarenes who had distinct, different beliefs from rabbinic Jews and later Christians. So they're not Orthodox Jews as we know them, or later Christians, right? So they are favorable in certain of the Quranic verses, and then later on, they are unfavorable. Later on, they're not favored. So this anomaly raises questions about the later interpretations that aligned all Christians with polytheism or idolatry, meaning there was a shift in the narrative. So we know at least the Quran is edited, right? There's some change that happens. So the use of Nasara came about during a time when the alliance between Arab factions and Judeo-Nazarenes was dissolving because they had to point fingers at somebody. So there's a political schism. The Nasara began to be categorized more negatively alongside Jews and Christians. So this changes our understanding over time. So the earlier Quranic texts were positive and the later texts condemned them.
And if you want to be a little bit more precise, the Nasara, they were categorized alongside Jews, especially Jews. Because it kind of made sense. It had to make sense.
If they're not associators, then they're more likely to be Jewish than Christian. Yes.
So they were condemned as Jews because they were Jews. They belong to the people of the book, as we saw together.
Right.
And so the condemnation was at the time it was coherent, sort of coherent. The thing is, when you decide that the Nasara are Christians, the former coherence of the condemnation does not make sense.
Yep. So yeah, look, for the audience, I know I'm rehashing perhaps some old ground, but I'm hopefully you have a good idea, or at least developing an understanding. There was a lot of complex things going on at that point in time. This is not a simple story, and there's history that goes back, and there's lots of factions, there's infighting, and hopefully something I can explore in depth, taking a couple of papers that I've worked on like 2 years ago that I've been meaning to present. Okay, so some historians infer that the Nasara, who followed a version of Christianity, version, and Arab Muslims shared a certain messianic belief, which later fractured, which is not impossible, right? So, in other words, look, again, it's a mess. It's a soup. I don't have to rehash this. We've already covered this. But any thoughts you want to add to this? I just want to mention there was a shift in the narrative.
It's the Islamic narrative reinterpretation of history and its own text. In the Quran, there is the mention of the Hanif, the one who had the true face. So the makers of the Islamic narrative had to make sense out of this. And so they invented this idea of pure monotheists enduring in the desert and coming to meet Muhammad. But they could not emphasize this point, because if you really look into it, should there have been Hanifs at the time of Muhammad, it would then mean that Muhammad had nothing new to reveal. So he was not a prophet. He was inspired by Hanifs. He might have been taught by Hanifs. And so you see here, the Nasara is a very sensitive topic for the Islamic narrative. Nasara and Hanif topic.
So it undermines the Islamic narrative because Muhammad supposedly brought the original primordial religion, and 2, he rescued Christianity. So, I mean, that's the narrative.
Yeah, but if you look deeply into the narrative, you see the incoherence. What he's supposed to have brought already existed. And when you look also within this narrative, there are some Jewish characters around Muhammad, especially Waraka bin Naufal, who is supposed to have been a Jew who converted to Nazarenism. So he was a sort of mentor to Muhammad. He is the one who acknowledged he was a true prophet. He is the one who acknowledged that the first verses he preached were actual divine revelation.
So this is clearly, again, I mean, I agree with you. It's some kind of Jewish leaning. It leans Jewish. There's some kind of weirdness there.
He was Nazarene. Nazarene, so from the Jewish people, but in a very minority movement.
Yeah, but so clearly there's something heretical going on there because it's not Christian. And they may claim it, but it's heretical by our standards.
And besides, think about it. Just think about this. Mecca was supposed to be a pagan city. This is another incoherence in the Islamic narrative. And in this pagan city, there was a Christian cleric, Waraka bin Naufal, who knew the Bible, who wrote Hebrew and Arabic, who translated the Bible into Arabic. It is within the Islamic narrative. But he didn't convert anybody in Mecca. And there was absolutely no influence from Christianity in Mecca, according to the Islamic narrative. This is another major incoherence within this narrative. So he cannot have been a Christian. Yeah. It does not make sense.
No, look, I mean, I did say also I want to excite questions. I want to raise questions because we don't always have the answers. But once you present all of these ideas, this creates questions like why this, why that, and the questions tell you, but this is not coherent. So hopefully that just points out. I don't always have the answer.
Another point: this guy Waraka was the cousin of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. We don't know whether she was a Nazarene herself, but she was cousin to this guy. And this guy married them. So he performed a religious ceremony. So there is a book very interesting from Joseph Hazi, a.k.a. Musa Abu al-Hariri, a Lebanese priest and scholar, who wrote the book, The Priest and the Prophet. And he compiled every story he found in the Islamic narrative about Waraka. And he came to the conclusion that he was a priest himself, since he performed the wedding. And it's a very, very interesting book. One that fueled Edouard Marie Gallet's thesis.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah. So, okay, yeah. Let's move on. Hopefully, the audience just gets little pieces of an understanding of the incoherence here, right? So, why are they Jewish and Talmudic myths? So, based on this, so you got all of these Quran verses that seem to be influenced by Talmudic legends. I mean, there are many others as well, but let's talk about those. For example, there are parallels with the story of Abraham and Nimrod, and the raven associated with Abel's body, the tale of Joseph and the orange peels, like and the Talmudic principle that states whoever kills one person, it is as if he has killed the whole world. Okay, so that's this from Talmud Sanhedrin. Right. These narratives are presented in the Quran as divine revelations from Allah rather than merely rabbinical legends. So this raises the question:
except for the one who just quoted, he who kills one person, because the Quran says he portrays God as telling, this is why we said to the sons of Israel, he who kills, and so on.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be, according to the Quran, it's supposed to be a Jewish law. Jewish, it's supposed to be Jewish.
So it's odd when those are the words of rabbis that have written their own moral interpretation of the law. So these are presented as divine revelations from Allah rather than merely as rabbinical legends. So this raises the question, why is it so important to include Jewish fables in the Quran? So this tells me there must be some heavy Jewish influence. So it seems significant enough that the Quran addresses this concern multiple times in response to critics who claim that these stories are merely asatir al-awwalin, or tales of those who came before, the tales of the ancients. Right, so this bothers whoever the author of the Quran is. So the intention was to establish the Quran as the original text predating creation. Why not just rewrite the Bible and then conclude the matter? But it decides to write its own thing. Why incorporate Jewish, Christian, even pagan Greek legends and others instead? Interesting question. Just an interesting question.
Very interesting question.
Right. So now part 2, and I'll come back to that point. I'll try and wrap. I'll try and connect these things. So part 2, a little bit of Hoyland, a bit of Walter. So we lost a few slides. Hopefully the last 10 slides, and we can call it a night on this one because we spent 42 minutes on the first 3 slides, Odon.
No.
So, okay, I just want to mention this. Now, this is a little controversial, and I'm cutting some pieces out for the sake of time, so that it might, at the risk of oversimplifying a bit or removing some detail. But so I'll give my interpretation. So J.J. Walters, someone asked me to also discuss this, and Odon, you remember that comment? It came on YouTube at one point. So this is J.J. Walters. So Analysis of the Quran Using Mathematical Code Theory by Jean-Jacques Walter. So his paper presents a new approach of understanding the authorship and composition of the Quran using mathematical code theory, specifically a technique called the analysis of text data. So we've got a name I cannot pronounce, Mr. Khan, like some bizarre fusion of Pan-Arabic warlords with Aramaic backgrounds. Yeah, because also apparently modern Arabic is derived from Aramaic, which is derived from what's the Lebanese, the group that found the Phoenician. But of course, prior to that, you had Yemeni Arabic, which was much more developed, right? So there's also that influence. The tame sheep ate Lloyd's slides. No, the tame sheep didn't eat them. I just cut out some text because I would have been a whole night discussing. So I'm trying to do an overview, not a deep investigation, right? So the author argues that the Quran was not the work of a single author, but a compilation by multiple authors over a period exceeding 200 years. Now, this doesn't conflict with anything you've said, I've said, and others have said. Many have said this. The issue is that people disagree with how he got to the conclusion, not what his conclusion is. So he draws on various influences from surrounding cultural and religious environment, including Greek, Jewish, and Christian traditions. Now, a note of caution, and I've skipped the first paragraph here, but this work presents a new methodological approach for Quran research, which has yielded valuable results for other classical texts and appears suitable in principle for analyzing layers of text genesis. We'll talk a little bit more about his method as we go, but generally this is from the what's the group? The Inara group wrote this, right? So they do.
Lloyd, I know Jean-Jacques Walter, or Walter. Actually, in French, we say Walter.
Voltaire.
I know him. I have his book in my boxes. And if you want your audience to understand his method, actually nowadays it's much more easy to understand his method thanks to AI.
Yeah, no, I was about to mention exactly that because.
Okay. So go on.
So methodology. So his thesis takes the results of analysis of the Quran using mathematical code theory, statistical analysis of the words and the sentences, right? And information on Islam and on its environment in the Middle East during the first 2 centuries after Muhammad. This includes Greek, Jewish, and Christian legends present in the region. He looks at the theology of local sects, apocryphal acts, Christian antiphonies, don't even ask me what that is, the Bible, and relevant sections of the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud. And he looks at accounts of historical events, which is pretty much, I think, what we do anyway. It's just how he assembles them that is novel here. Some of these sources appeared 5 centuries before Islam. It's 500 years. Others, notably the Jewish and Christian legends, were written just prior to the Quran's emergence. All were present in the region by the time Islam was born. So all of the source material we find in the Quran was present before the Quran was written or conceived in Muhammad's little twinkle of his eye or whatever it was. So he takes this, he combines all these disciplines, and he produces some new research results. So the theory pertains to written texts and claims to identify an author with a confidence level exceeding 999,999 chances in a million. Although, statistically, when you apply to other texts, this method yields about an 85% reliability. So maybe he's overstating the probabilities here, but it's been found to be 80 to 85% reliable when analyzing text. As long as he's not using ChatGPT. Yeah. Yeah. So he says each of the authors, based on the statistical analysis of the word, the writing style, and so on, the word usage, each author has unique stylistic traits which are unconscious, which mathematics or statistical analysis can uncover. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is fact. The theory asks whether the stylistic features identified in one text can be found in another. So researchers can determine if different segments of the same book were written by a single author or multiple authors. Over to you, Odon.
The way he worked was not by doing a sort of blunt force analysis of the Quran. Instead, he made selection within the Quran because he already had, he's an Islamologist. He already knew about Islamic studies. So, for example, he singled out every verse with a Nasara occurrence. So 14 verses and 15 occurrences. And he studied this selection against the whole of the rest of the Quran. And his conclusion is this selection has been made by different authors than the rest of the Quran. This is how he worked. Mm-hmm. And he did so with many other. There is one very interesting selection he did. He took every verse that starts with "kul," say this, and he mathematically proved that all those verses are different. Their authors are different from the rest of the Quran, and by proving this is how he came to the conclusion of the 200 years span. I think, in my opinion, I think it's wrong because he stated the hypothesis that the kul were added during the Abbasid era when the Quran was declared divine. And because of this, at the time, there were some verses that could not have been, that without, if you take back the kul, without the say at the beginning, they cannot be understood as coming from God. So he put forth the hypothesis that the say was added at this time, so around the time of Caliph al-Mutawakkil. So I think it's 847, something like this. And this is why he claims a 200 years span for the writing of the Quran. But one could also argue that those kul or say at the beginning of these verses might have been added before. Mm-hmm. The idea of God speaking in the Quran does not date from Caliph al-Mutawakkil in the 9th century. I think it dates from before.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a fair argument to make. So, when applied to the Quran, it reveals the presence of multiple authors, different writing dates, and previously hidden structures. So, there's a scientific perspective that looks at the early stages of Islam differently, its characteristics, historical development, and a new understanding of contemporary Islam. Okay, so he challenges this. So briefly, this theory is very similar to AI software designed to detect whether a text has been plagiarized or generated by artificial intelligence rather than composed by a human. So these tools analyze stylistic and structural elements. They do statistical analysis of words, right? They do predictive analysis. They do
letters, punctuation marks, everything within the text.
Yep. And they look at all this, and so he basically employed mathematical methods to discern an author's unique stylistic signature, the characteristics, their particular style that identifies them. So it tries to figure out who's the author and the coherence of writing across different texts, whether they be parts of the same work or separate documents. So in different documents, you can identify the same author from a previous document. So that's what is happening here. So his study supports 5 key assertions. So welcome, Andrew. Good to see you. So yeah, the heretical problem is Nestorianism around the 500s. And the Nestorian issue is of importance to Islam if you look at the narrative around Saint Paul, because they claim that he started the Nestorian church, right? That's the Islamic claim, that Paul started the Nestorian church. So Paul was like 500 years old at the time, but okay. So the Quran was authored by at least 30 different writers, possibly around 50, and potentially as many as 100, right? So that's not odd. I mean, if you think how many chapters there are, how many verses there are, how many scribes were there. The Quran was composed over a span of more than 200 years. And I think that's not an unusual claim. I mean, there were certainly edits. I'm not saying they wrote it for 200 years consistently, but there were edits at different periods which suited different political agendas at the time. I think that's a reasonable assumption. The division between Medina and Mecca period lacks significance, and this is not a new idea, but that seems to be an artificial distinction. Muhammad was established as the founder of Islam after his death, with a time frame of 60 years up to 200 years later, and redacted back into the Quran. That idea is also not brand new, right, Odon?
Yeah. What's very interesting with this study is that he uses a completely different approach than the one of researchers, scholars, academia scholars. It's not about studying the Quran, looking at the meaning of the verses and so on. It's a mathematical analysis. And this mathematical analysis converges with other studies. There are other studies about the division between Medina and
he comes to the same conclusions.
Yeah, and that's the thing that is very interesting. Different methods converging towards the same result. Which
I found strange that people gave him such a hard time. He gets criticized, but he comes to exactly the same conclusions. So they really are critical of his method, but his method is sound.
You see, I told you I know him. I've met him. I've discussed extensively his research, and a friend of mine also met his son, because actually he worked with his son. He's a genius. He's a physicist. So he has several PhDs, one in physics, one in psychology, and one in Islamology. He's 90 plus years. No, he's someone is from another planet. And his son is a top-notch mathematician. He is the one who wrote the software for the mathematical analysis. And he told my friend that when he started to work with his father on this book, on this study, it was around 2010. And my friend met him something like 3 or 4 years ago. And he told him that everything has changed thanks to the development of AI and so on. And this kind of study is now much more easy to make. And there should be many, many more in the future. So we are on
language models.
There is a new era of mathematical and computerized studies of the Quran that will yield a lot of interesting results.
There's one group that was discussing using LLMs to go through PhD papers and doctoral theses and stuff to look for plagiarism. And apparently this is terrifying academia, because now they can be found out. And so, yeah, I mean, the technology is now prevalent and it's being used in academia today. So what he did here was just ahead of his time, but I don't know why the guy got such a bad name or bad rap, because he came to the same conclusions as everyone else, just his method was different. But yeah, and the earliest form of Islam emerged from a sect present in the Near East at the time known as the Nazarenes. Interesting. These Nazarenes pop up again, these Nasara, So Islam emerges from the Nasara, but it seems that, and eventually they split from the Nasara, and then they were the bad guys all of a sudden, and then these were the pure ones. So there doesn't seem to be an original Islam. It seems that it was actually birthed from a particular Jewish, Christian, Messianic, unorthodox, heretical milieu. So he supports the same thesis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Actually, in my view, there was a very essential influence of the Nazarenes among the Arab faction that took Jerusalem and rebuilt its temple. And the other influence of the Nazarene was that on the making of the Quran, because I think they were the one who were teaching Muhammad and maybe other prophets. They were teaching him all the Bible stuff and everything we see in the Quran. And so there were other Arab movements at the time, or other apocalyptical movements.
So they stole from these movements and then separated themselves.
Yeah, but you see, so there was this Jerusalem factions with the Nazarenes, and there were other factions. So there was one who took Egypt, one who took Syria, one who went to Mesopotamia. But in the end, since they had to make do with the Quranic text, there was a sort of a second wave of Nazarene influence, since they had to reinterpret and to make sense out of the Quran, who is strongly connected to the Nazarenes. But there are other influences within Islam. So the influences from these other Arab factions, and the influence from, for example, Rabbinic Judaism in Mesopotamia, the influence from Persian culture when Islam was created in Baghdad, influence from Far Eastern populations or individuals. If you take At-Tabari, for example, At-Tabari, he was not an Arab.
I mean, all of these guys are from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan,
with
everything's done.
You see how the soup, as you called it, was made.
Yeah.
So there are maybe some basis ingredients with the Nazarene topics and so on, but there are other ingredients from Kazakhstan, from Baghdad, from everywhere.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems that if they emerge from the milieu at the time, then they were highly familiar with all of these, and it seems they were part of this group. And then later on, they formulated their own theology and then separated themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to create something radically different so that they weren't just lumped in with the same group. Because remember, they were first friendly and then they weren't friendly. So there was a development over time. So these ideas, and there's a sixth new assertion that he makes. The foundation of early Islam was not rooted in monotheism, but in anti-Christian, anti-Trinitarian sentiment. Hopefully this starts to put together everything that I discussed previously, and everything's starting to merge a little bit now. And then we'll go look at some other voices as well. So that's something else that he's coming up with. And this matches what we discussed earlier. There's something anti-Trinitarian about it. You know, and then they separate themselves.
You remember, Lloyd, we discussed this already. I told you that the main point is not differentiating between monotheism and polytheism, but it's about differentiating between Christianity and post-Christian movements. I think it's much more relevant to understand, in order to understand religious movements, because monotheism or polytheism are not very, they do not define a creed, actually. The creed is defined by the way you get salvation.
Right.
So this is why it's important, because the Christians or Christianity was the first religion to come with the idea of salvation.
So they wanted to capture a monopoly on salvation. They want to be the one.
When they claim anti-Trinitarian, when they claim anti-Trinitarism or Trinitarianism, if you look into the claim, the claim is Jesus is not the savior. Something else is the savior. We are the saviors, for example, because we will rebuild the temple and establish God's kingdom on earth, and this will bring salvation. So it's not about Jesus bringing salvation. We are bringing salvation by being God's auxiliaries.
Right. Yeah. And someone's, hey, DQS, we'll do something next week. Let me get in touch with you. Yeah, and someone says it sounds like the Aryan cult never disappeared. It seeped into the culture Middle East-wise. And it's not just that. These heretical groups, as we'll discover, if we continue, I mean, Odon, if we continue this series and I bring up some other papers and some other research, stuff that isn't known publicly right now, but I mean, fascinating research that establishes so much amazing history that these someone would grab an idea, change it the way he likes it, and boom, off you go. New religion, new saint, new savior, new messiah, whatever the heck. And they would modify, they would take ideas and change them as they saw fit. There was no sort of strict dictionary definition of anything, because they would make it up as they went. They're Gnostics.
But I think the process was very gradual. Small invention upon small invention.
Yeah.
The first invention is we will help Jesus doing his mission, for example. So we become God's auxiliaries. And by becoming God's auxiliaries, when God doesn't do the work we think he should do, then we will do it instead. And we became sort of divine elite within humanity.
Then that would be the Gnostics, because the divine elite would be your Gnostics. You're looking at Gnostics, and eventually it becomes more concrete as a complete ideology or theology. Then later becomes concrete. Okay, let's try and finish this. Let's try and see if I can do 6 more pages in the next few minutes. Let's see. Key points. So he uses mathematical code theory to find distinct signatures, right? So these correspond to different authors that were responsible for different parts of the text, different themes. Right? The Quran, 30 to 100 authors, right? Process spanning hundreds of years. None of that's actually controversial today, at least within the group that we're addressing now. So he says the distinction between Meccan and Medinan surahs lacks historical validity. The allocation of verses does not align with the proposed timeline of authorship, and Muhammad's role as the founding prophet of Islam was established well after his death. And the early Islamic beliefs were heavily influenced by the Nazarenes, a sect that were present in the region at the time, rather than based on monotheism. So, a soup. Okay, so the Quran, written over more than 2 centuries. And okay, let's skip over this page, go to the next one. Let's do the final section now. Robert Hoyland on Crone, on Patricia Crone. He was a student with her at the time, right? And Mushrikun. So, I'm going to go through 6 points, 3 where he agrees and 3 where he disagrees, right? So he supports Crone's assertion that the Mushrikun were not just polytheists, that a more complex understanding of monotheism, right? Meaning that they had a very complex view, as she says, a mitigated monotheism that was blended with all sorts of ideas, including some sort of vaguely pagan and other religious ideas. Both emphasize the importance of understanding the Quran, as Odon does, from its historical and cultural context, looking at what the Quran actually says, not later exegetical traditions or the sin, the standard Islamic narrative. So they both agree. Economic activities. Now here's something interesting. Hoyland agrees with Crone's analysis regarding the economic activities of the Mushrikun. The Mushrikun had agricultural practices, obviously not in Mecca, which he believes are essential to understanding their societal structure. The Quran, however, presents the Mushrikun as agriculturalists and the believers as traders. Now, we know Mecca was not a trade center. We also know Mecca was not an agricultural center. We know that the traders and agriculturalists were, you can go to Yemen and you'll find both. Yemen meets all the criteria that everyone applies to Petra and all the other places. Yemen meets those criteria 100%, and it's a lot closer, and it's tied a lot more culturally into Arabia than people realize. So you've got traders, and these people were trading over land, and they were trading by sea, and they were heavily involved in the region, right? The Yemenis. So that would meet interesting. So you've got these traders. So they couldn't have been the Arabs. The Arabs were Bedouins. I mean, that's very odd.
No. The Bedouins were Bedouins from the Arab people, but there were many Arabs that were agriculturers, there were sedentary merchants that live in villages, in towns, and so on. There were not only traders or Bedouins or nomads, but they were seen as nomads because they used to be nomads.
Yeah, and they'd like to still push the idea that they were nomads, and therefore they, that's part of the narrative, right? So, but this should tell us at least, hold on, but these people were traders and agriculturalists. Where do we find these two activities taking place? Which groups were involved in this activity? Now, divine communication, interesting point here. Hoyland believes that the Mushrikūn saw a very clear separation between God and humans. They thought that divine messages could not come directly to a human without an intermediary. Crone disagreed, though, or he disagreed with Crone. She saw more of an integration between the divine and human realms, which would lead us to specifically idolatry, right? So you're looking at mediation versus idolatry. So there's this idea as well, more integration between the divine and human realms. The paper that I read doesn't go into much depth on this, but any thought on this, Odon? Because these religious ideas or this worldview could give us a clue as to who we're talking about and where. We might be able to trace a group.
In French, we have a saying for this kind of discussion. We say it's couper les cheveux en quatre. They are splitting hairs.
Okay.
Because, I think the Quran is much more simple than this. There is still among those two authors a strong influence from the Islamic narrative. For example, when Crone talks about the pagan practice of the Mushrikun of killing their infant daughters, actually the text does not say this. The text says the daughters are abandoned in the dust. But it can refer to many different practices. For example, putting one's daughter to the door of a monastery, which was it was not that common, but it existed among Christians.
You said once before that they try to invent these bad things and then try to say, we don't do that, we're better than that, just to give them a way to differentiate themselves. Because even at the time, in the region,
every ideology does this.
Just
an ideology, excuse me, Lloyd.
Cultures in the region are known, for instance, men had up to 20 wives back then, right? So
not among Christians.
Not among Christians, exactly. So I mean, how do you get so many women if you're burying them all? It doesn't make sense.
And we have ancient sources telling us about, and even the Islamic narrative telling us about very strong women in the Arab world, starting with Khadija. Khadija was a strong, independent, wealthy, influential woman. So not at all the kind of woman that is supposed to be, is supposed to live in the Jahiliyyah time, the time of ignorance. In the Islamic narrative, there is also the story of a false prophetess, Sadija. I don't remember her exact name, but there are also stories, for example, of Queen Zenobia. She was a queen, or tribes that are led by women, Arab tribes led by women. So this whole thing about the status of women having been bettered by Islam is an invention which is typical of every ideology. Every ideology portrays the past as being dark and obscure and so on. And the ideology brings light.
It's their founding myth. It's their founding myth.
They needed a Middle Age.
Right.
For their life to make sense. And so they portrayed the times before Islam as being cruel, brutal, and so on, because they needed to justify Islam. They needed to justify that Islam brought something at least a bit better.
Okay, right. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So, yeah. Okay, so I wasn't necessarily wanting to come to any particular conclusion, but I wanted to present some evidence and ask a few questions that hopefully illustrates that the Quranic story, whether you read the Quran literally or whether you read it figuratively or whether you follow the standard narrative, none of it makes any sense. Right. So the influence of Jewish Christianity. Now, Crone argues for significant Jewish Christian influence on the Quran. Right. Hoyland, he says the Quran presents its own unique theological perspective rather than reflecting contemporary beliefs. Right.
Right. They are both right.
Yes, that's fascinating. Because maybe it's at different times. Because but these. It doesn't necessarily happen at the same time, but at different times, the Quran is speaking about things that,
But
go on. Do you want anything else you want to add?
When Hoyland says that the Quran does not reflect contemporary belief, this assertion cannot be, because obviously the Quran reflects something that was believed at the time, at least by the people preaching the Quran. So this belief existed.
We may want to clarify what he says here with the next statement. So he has a methodological disagreement with Crone, and he speaks of syncretism. So he says that she dismisses the existence of distinct Jewish Christian sects, right? So she dismisses apparently the existence of distinct Jewish Christian sects. He says a spectrum of beliefs that blended elements of both Judaism and Christianity and potentially other ideas influenced early Islamic thought. Right? So he speaks of a spectrum, a syncretism. So there's that. That's what he speaks of. So it's not that there's unique. It's unique in that it's taking pieces from what exists already. It's just a new mixture. So
the uniqueness of the Quranic belief, I think it comes from the adaptation.
Yeah,
it's an adaptation for an Arab audience of some Jewish Christian beliefs, but they are adapted. For example, the dietary laws, they include common laws from Judaism. So do not eat pork, do not eat carrion, and so on. But they do not forbid camel.
Yeah. We mentioned the Judaizers wanted to include dietary laws as well. So, I mean, there's an overlap there. But then, of course, remember, if you're a Gnostic, you're going to mix it up the way you like it, because there were so many Gnostic, even the early church fathers, you read them, they'll speak of all these Gnostics would make up new doctrines on the day at the whatever, as they saw fit. But also everyone would come up with his own idea and then form his own theology, just off the cuff. This wasn't unheard of. You're going to adapt things to suit your temperament.
If you take into account the Nazarenes' view, they needed to attract Christian Arabs to their cause, and they couldn't do it by forbidding their main animal, the camel.
Yeah, that's to adapt it. Yeah, so Hoyland is maybe mincing words a bit here. You might be, like when he says no, but it's unique. It's not. It's like me taking half an apple, half a pear. I stick them together, and he says no, it's completely unique, never seen before. Yeah, sure, it's never. But it's
and besides, there is another thing to explain the uniqueness. It's just that we didn't know about the Jewish movement that bore this kind of belief. We didn't know about it because it was too small.
Crone didn't know about some of the other movements later as well, so she couldn't factor that into her analysis.
We have a sort of lamplight dilemma. You know about the lamplight dilemma?
No.
It's almost a funny story. A guy comes home at night, and he finds another guy crawling on all fours under a lamplight in the street.
Oh yes, why are you searching over
there? What are you doing? I'm looking for my keys, but they're not here. Yeah, but this is the only place where there is light.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So it's also, I mean, as we are now, we have more information available to us. I mean, the internet and databases and so on, we can find things that people couldn't before. I mean, so yeah, so we can fill in gaps that they had. Okay, so then I'll do one page on this. This is also from another perspective. Stories Between Christianity and Islam by Reyhan Durmaz. Saints, Memory, and Cultural Exchange in Late Antiquity and Beyond. So she talks about Islam exchanging stories with other religions like Christianity in their daily meetings. So definition and role of mushrikūn. There are those who commit shirk. So that from her definition, from her book, right, her understanding. So they associate partners with God, which is seen as idolatry or polytheism. The Quran refers to this group as opponents of Muhammad, right? Not friends now, opponents in the 7th century Arabian belief system. So the mushrikūn are differentiated from Jews and Christians, right, in the Quran and later interpretations, and they're generally recognized as people of the book. However, Christians are then included in the term mushrikūn, as we see they eventually are. So the relationship between mushrikūn, Jews, and Christians, they might have held monotheistic views mixed with local polytheistic practices, indicating they were not strictly idolatrous, but had a sense of a single creator God, Allah. That's another verification of what we were speaking about, unless she's just quoting the same sources, in which case it's just circular reporting. Right. Scholars like G.R. Horting challenge the simplistic view of mushrikun as mere idolaters, which overlooks how complex the ideas were, right, and the influence on Islam. And the use of terms like kufar and mushrikun shows an understanding of different groups and their theological branches against monotheism. So clearly there was a competition. There were different groups that were setting themselves apart. At first they seemed unified, and then they became divided and they set themselves apart. So there's ideological conflicts, which involves not only polytheists, quote unquote, but also various sects of Judaism and early Christianity. That's what she finds. So mushrikun are oversimplified as idolaters, but there was an intricate blend of beliefs with elements of monotheism that didn't match Islamic definitions. But this is monotheism plus other ideas. So we can always think, what are her sources? But she comes to the same conclusion. She could just be reporting, as I said, everything we've been reporting from the same sources. But you've got another source that effectively verifies everything we're saying here, that there's something complex going on. And then finally, last couple of slides, G.R. Horting. Mushrikun could be understood as monotheists who had a different concept of God. Okay, monotheists who had a different concept. This is his book, The Idea of Idolatry and the Emergence of Islam, From Polemic to History by G.R. Horting. Mushrikun as monotheists, so they recognize the singular divine authority, but with differing beliefs and practices compared to emerging Islamic monotheism. Islam was emergent, was not fully formed. He critiques the binary classification of religious identities, monotheism versus polytheism, right? Because he says there was something weird going on here, a mixture of the two. You didn't have strict monotheism, you didn't have polytheism. There was this weird syncretism going on. Islam only later adopted this strict monotheistic view according to its own definition. Horting's work connects the Quranic depiction of the mushrikun to earlier Near Eastern religious traditions. We've discussed that already. The Near Eastern, because he said it was simply Near Eastern, was it the Orthodox, Near Eastern Orthodoxy Church? So he said it's all just Near Eastern Christianity, suggesting that the Quran has a dialogue with these traditions rather than a complete rejection of them. Your thoughts on that? Your thoughts on Horting's ideas here? Hold on. I mean, I'm not sure I agree necessarily with the guy, but
no, the thing with Horting, I've met him also. I don't know him as well as Walter, but I met him at an INARA conference, and the thing with him is very, very frustrating because he has all the elements. He has some hints and hunches, but he's sort of beating around the bush. You know, he does not connect all the dots. He connects some of them, and so we have, for example, when he talks about the shirk as being a sort of parallel to the shituf of Jews, he has understood something, but he sort of misses the whole picture, the big picture. And maybe, and it's almost the same with Crone. Houghton and Crone, they were very close in their views of early Islam and so on. But
she was heavily influenced by him.
They live at a time where there was no internet. They paved the way for people like you or me or others. They were very influential, but the internet and computerized studies will change, and they have already changed everything.
Yeah. Yeah, so they speak of Mushrikun as neither fully Jewish nor Christian, but something in between. So that's fair enough. These are heresies, effectively, right?
But the only thing that allow them to say that Mushrikun are not Christians is the Islamic interpretation of some pagan customs in the Quran. And like I told you, when you really look into it, it's not about paganism. It's about Christian or mostly Christian and sometimes Jewish customs or practices.
Right.
But the way the Islamic narrative interprets it makes it look as pagan.
Yeah, they tried to separate themselves. I think they were part of this mix, and then they had to somehow separate themselves, and then they condemned everyone. That what?
Exactly. They needed to invent a sort of pure Arab religion
and claim that they were the ones, and then
page, without any influence from Christianity, Judaism, and any other religion or heresy or so on.
But yet still claim some kind of continuity with them, which is odd.
Yeah, because there is indications of a sort of continuity in the Quran with the Hanif topic, for example.
Right.
And that's the thing. The thing with the construction of Islam is that the makers of Islam, of its narrative, were stuck with the Quranic text. They could not change it. The way they would, the way, for example, Joseph Smith invented his own sacred text, and because of this, the narrative is constrained. You see, there were many constraints that exerted upon the building of the narrative. They could not invent everything they wanted. They had to explain a text that was already there and that they could not change.
Right. Yeah, so they just painted themselves into a corner. Mr. Khan says there's a strange correlation between Islam and the various Eastern Orthodox Byzantine sects. You know, I have looked at that, and I'd say there are questions to be asked. When I look at the Islamic connection to the Byzantines, yeah, there's something there that I think, yeah, there's something weird there. Yep. So then basically they said that these mushrikūns have ties to Jewish and Christian traditions, but they are neither. Now notice though, there's the comment that I had last week, I think, where they mentioned the Sabi, and they claim to be Jews, they claim to be Christians, but they are neither. They're between the two. The Sabi. Remember Muhammad was a Sabi? So they claim that the Sabi are between the Jews and the Christians, but are neither of the two. Now you've got ties to both Jewish and Christian traditions, but are neither of the two. I mean, it's just odd, these little odd parallels. So now let's go. Was that it? Was that the last slide? Oh my golly, yeah. We hit the last slide. Fantastic.
You made it, Lloyd. Congratulations. You made it.
This is the last slide that I had, which I decided to clear now, but let me just finish this thing. So, question, standard Islamic narrative. Muhammad arose as a prophet and preached to a mixed polytheist Arab, Jewish, and Christian audience at Mecca and Medina. Right? Then Muhammad tries to convert his audience to a sort of primordial, original religion, correcting corrupted scriptures passed down by Jews and Christians. Is there evidence that Mo is in fact addressing a polytheist audience in Mecca? No, there's not. And yeah, so anyway, but just that was the slide. I was working on something else. But okay, that's it. We're done. So finally we finished these slides. So what did you get out of this, Oda? What did you learn from this? You know, did you get anything out of it? And as the audience, what did you learn from this?
Oh, that there might have been. I'm always referring to the mushrikūn as being Christians, but Christian doesn't mean fully Orthodox Christian. And what I got from your presentation is that there might have been, and there surely have been, influences from other religion and so on. But I don't think it changes the fact that mostly they are Christians. And it's the same with Christians today. If you really look into Christians' belief, you will find that most of them, or some of them, also have Gnostic beliefs or Messianic beliefs that they don't realize, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was kind of the same during this time. The mistake we often make is to consider that people from previous times were completely different from us. They were sort of more primitive and so on. Actually, they thought the same way. They had the same kind of expectations. The difference being that they had different ways of seeing the world or different ways of expressing these beliefs. But it's the same nowadays. There are many Christians, for example, who want to save the world by building God's kingdom on earth. It was kind of the same with the Christians that joined the Nazarenes, who wanted to save the world by hastening the coming of the Messiah.
But also, there's also the apocalyptic angle, which is present in all of these Jewish, Messianic, Gnostic ideas.
That's a difference between Western Christians and 7th century Middle East Christianity, or even 7th century Christianity. We in the Western world, the Christians in the Western world, have lost the sense of times, the sense of that there is an end time coming. Most of them don't know about the second coming of Jesus. It's supposed to be in their creed, but they cannot explain it. And because of this, they gave way to other meaning for the end of times, other meanings, other ideologies starting with Protestantism. But other ideologies took the place that was left vacant. You see, it's very interesting to study Christianity as a belief. It works with two legs. There is the personal salvation, so the idea that through a relationship with Jesus, you are saved. And there is a common, a communal salvation, a salvation for mankind that will happen at the end of times. And if you want to really understand the Christian faith, you have to always consider that those two legs go together. You cannot separate the personal dimension from the communal dimension. And what we see in the 7th century is an emphasis on the communal dimension, the idea of Jesus coming back to establish God's kingdom and so on. And what we see today in Western Christianity is the contrary, an emphasis on the personal dimension, and Christian forgetting about the communal dimension of their faith, and so giving way to other ways to fulfill the communal salvation by creating a world of peace, by globalism, by believing Pope Francis when he speaks about a world of brotherhood, like he wrote in Fratelli Tutti, for example. Now it's very, very interesting to to understand that what happened during the 7th century is not that remote from us. And this is why it's interesting to look at all these different currents and movements from the 7th century, but not as a scientist would do with insects, studying things that he has no relations to, but as things that have an impact on us even today. So it's a weird conclusion, maybe, but maybe one you didn't expect, Lloyd. I don't know.
Yeah, that was a tad unexpected. Yeah, but so yeah, hopefully that was useful to the audience to examine Islam from different perspectives and show that all of these scholars converge. And I think with new information, we can refine these theses that they had 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But there's also very, very good information from 60 years ago that we've forgotten, from 100 years ago. And we can start to examine those, and we can start to tie these older works into some of the newer research, and we can synthesize this. So we can, I think we can start to converge on the truth. Although I do think sometimes people are a little bit too dogmatic about it, because we cannot have total certainty. But I think what I'd like to do is maybe in the future, near future, talk about, I've already got a couple of excellent papers that are worth examining on Christianity in Arabia and the fights, the theological battles, and the fights with paganism and heresies and Gnosticism and the story that we don't really know about, but the presence of Christianity in Arabia in the early centuries. That because there was always this denial that there was such a thing. It was all pagan. Then we discover it's not pagan. Then it's Christian, but it's not really Christian. It's actually a whole mixture of heresies. And the Christians were present, but they were having difficulty because he had all these fake texts, fake messiahs, fake prophets, and there was a huge set of fights going on. And yeah, so Arabia, Heresium Ferax, the bearer of all heresies, worth investigating. So perhaps we can do that in the future. Hold on, in the near future.
Gladly.
Because there's some fantastic papers. I've got to dig up the old paper, the one that started me off some time ago. I've been meaning to do it. So yeah, guys, I think we can call it a night. Thank you all very much for the kind support. Thanks for the chat. I hope it was useful. Hopefully you've gained something of value. And yeah, thanks, Odin, for accompanying me on this discussion, and throwing in your knowledge, your experience, and your expertise as well. Hopefully we've all learned something. But yeah, I think we can realize that Islam is not true. It's definitely something fishy there. There's too many questions that don't have good answers. And the answers that we do have are not good either.
Exactly.
Yep. So guys, thank you very much. And I'll see you tomorrow night. I'll be on with Saint Murad. He and I will be discussing his new Quran translation. So I've got him tomorrow evening at 9 p.m. That is exactly now. We'll be starting now, tomorrow night, at this time tomorrow night. So it's 9 p.m. here now. So guys, thank you very much. We'll see you soon. And Odon, thank you very much. God bless.
Bye-bye.